In a sun-scorched suburb of Orlando, where the asphalt shimmered with heat and the air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and distant saltwater, stood a little girl named Susie. She was 9 years old, her blonde hair tied into 2 messy pigtails, her face speckled with freckles she secretly despised. Susie stood behind a wobbly plywood table set up on the uneven sidewalk. On it were neatly arranged packets of gingerbread cookies she'd baked with her grandmother. Each cookie was decorated with uneven but loving swirls of icing. The price, $1 each. Above the table hung a cardboard sign, scrawled in marker. Susie's gingerbread, delicious and for a good cause. The neighborhood was quintessential middle-class America. Tidy lawns, mailboxes adorned with tiny American flags, kids zipping by on bikes. But for Susie, this day was special. She wasn't just selling cookies. She was raising money for her grandmother, Marge, who had raised her since she was 3, after her parents vanished from her life. Marge had been diagnosed with a heart condition, and while Medicaid covered some costs, the rest was a mountain too steep for their modest budget. Susie decided her gingerbread was her chance to help. Gingerbread, fresh, homemade, her small voice barely cut through the hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. 2 hours passed, and no one stopped. Mrs. Crowley from the house next door jogged by, muttering something about her diet. Mr. Gonzalez, always grumbling about noise in the neighborhood, gave Susie a sideways glance and kept walking. 2 teens on skateboards snickered, pointing at her sign, one shouting, "Who's gonna buy your wonky cookies, kid?" Susie clenched her fists, but didn't cry. She remembered what her grandmother always said, "Hold your head high, even when it hurts." She straightened her sign and called out again, "Gingerbread, help my grandma." The sun beat down, and Susie felt sweat trickle down her back. Her sneakers were dusted with dirt, and her hope was melting faster than the icing on her cookies. She didn't know that around the corner, in the shade of palm trees, someone was watching her, someone whose presence could change everything. Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend, was in town. He'd come to Orlando to shoot a commercial for a local charity. Exhausted from cameras and the heat, he decided to take a walk through the suburbs, reminiscing about the days he played in local gyms. Shaq, as his friends called him, wore a plain gray t-shirt, shorts, and a cap pulled low over his eyes. Even out of uniform, he was a mountain of a man, and passers-by turned whispering, "Is that Shaq?" He noticed Susie as he turned onto her street. At first, her sign caught his eye, not so much the words, but the way she carefully adjusted it. Then he heard her voice, small but persistent. Shaq stopped, lingering behind a tree, and watched. Something about the scene tugged at him. Maybe it was her stubbornness. Maybe it was memories of his own childhood, standing on a corner selling lemonade to buy new sneakers. But not everyone in the neighborhood was as kind-hearted as Shaq. A few houses down lived Roy Baker, a 62-year-old veteran known for his temper. Roy was the head of the local homeowners association and believed any activity on the street needed his approval. Spotting Susie's table, he scowled. To him, it was a violation of order, a kid cluttering the sidewalk. Roy stepped out of his house, phone in hand, ready to call the police about illegal vending. "Hey you!" he barked, striding toward Susie. His voice was sharp as a snapping branch. "Who gave you permission to sell here?" Susie froze. Her eyes widened, but she answered, trying not to tremble. I'm just selling gingerbread, sir, for my grandma. She needs an operation." Roy snorted, his face reddening. "I don't care who it's for. We have rules here. You can't just set up a table and yell on the street. Pack it up, or I'm calling the cops." Neighbors began peering out of windows. Mrs. Crowley, who'd ignored Susie earlier, now stood on her porch, shaking her head. The skateboard teens returned, filming the scene on their phones. Susie felt her cheeks burn. She wanted to run, to hide, but she thought of her grandmother, lying in bed, barely breathing. "Please," she said softly, "I don't want trouble. I just want to help." "Help." Roy stepped closer, his shadow looming over her. "You're breaking the law, and I won't let kids ruin our neighborhood." Shaq, still watching from a distance, felt anger rising. He knew men like Roy, people who used authority to belittle others. But instead of stepping in right away, he waited. He was curious to see how Susie would handle it. He saw something special in her, a spark that didn't flicker, even under pressure. Susie took a deep breath. Her voice shook, but she didn't look away from Roy. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but I'm not doing anything wrong. I can move the table if I have to, but would you try a gingerbread first? I baked them with my grandma. They're really good." Roy blinked, caught off guard. He expected tears or defiance. Not this. Susie held out a cookie with both hands, as if it were a treasure. Her eyes shone, not with fear, but with hope. "Are you kidding?" Roy sneered. "I don't need your cookies. Get out," I said. "Wait a minute." A deep, calm voice cut through. Everyone turned. Shaquille O'Neal stepped out of the shadows, his massive frame dwarfing even Roy. The teens stopped filming, their jaws dropping. Mrs. Crowley gasped. Roy took a step back, his confidence wavering. "I heard there's gingerbread for sale," Shaq said, smiling at Susie. "How much for one?" Susie blinked, hardly believing her eyes. She knew who he was. Her grandma loved basketball and often talked about Shaq. $1, she stammered. Shaq pulled out his wallet and placed a $20 bill on the table. "Then I'll take 20, and maybe have a word with this gentleman," he nodded at Roy, "about supporting a good cause." Roy flushed deeper, but he didn't back down. "This isn't about cookies. It's about order. She has no right to sell here." Shaq raised an eyebrow, his smile cooling. "Order, huh? How about kindness? This girl's trying to save her grandma, and you're yelling at her in front of everyone. Maybe you could learn a thing or two from her and chill out." Neighbors began to murmur. Mrs. Crowley, still on her porch, called out, "Roy, she's just a kid. Leave her be." The teens, who'd been laughing earlier, now nodded, one shouting, "I'll buy a cookie." Susie felt warmth spread through her chest. For the first time that day, she didn't feel alone. Shaq took a gingerbread and bit into it, his eyes widening. "Man, these are good." He turned to the growing crowd. "Y'all are missing out on something special." Roy stood, lips tight. He felt the situation slipping from his control. Shaq turned back to him, his voice quieter but firmer. "You know, I grew up in a neighborhood where people helped each other. Maybe it's time you remembered what it means to be a neighbor. Now, Susie, tell me about your grandma." Susie began to speak about how Marge taught her to bake, sang old songs, always made time to listen. The crowd listened, and even Roy, despite his anger, couldn't look away. Something in Susie's words made him remember his own childhood, when his mother baked cookies and the house smelled of vanilla. But the tension didn't fade. Roy wasn't ready to give in, and the neighbors were divided, some siding with Susie, others believing Roy had a point. Shaq knew one cookie wouldn't change everything. It would take something bigger, something to make this neighborhood see Susie not as a problem, but as part of their community. End of Part 1. Part 2. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the Orlando sky in shades of pink and orange. On the street where Susie stood, the air cooled, But the tension only grew. The small crowd of neighbors buzzed like a hive. Some whispered in support of the girl. Others exchanged glances, unsure whether to get involved in a conflict with Roy Baker. Roy stood with his arms crossed, his face stern, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. Shaquille O'Neal's words about kindness had hit their mark, though Roy wasn't ready to admit it. Susie held another gingerbread, offering it to Shaq. Her small fingers trembled slightly, but she tried to stay steady. Shaq, massive and calm as an oak in a storm, crouched down to her eye level. His smile was as warm as summer sun. "So, you're saying these gingerbreads are your grandma's recipe?" he asked, studying the cookie like it was a piece of art. "Yes, sir," Susie replied, her voice a little stronger. "She taught me to add a pinch of cinnamon and some honey. Says it makes them special." Shaq nodded, took another bite, and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "You know, I've eaten cookies all over the world, from Paris to Tokyo. But these gingerbreads, they're top tier." The crowd chuckled. Even Mrs. Crowley, still standing on her porch with her arms crossed, couldn't hide a smile. One of the teens, the one who'd mocked Susie earlier, shuffled closer and awkwardly pulled $1 from his pocket. "Yo, gimme one," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. Susie handed him a cookie, her eyes lighting up. "Thank you," she said softly. But Roy wasn't ready to back down. He felt his authority slipping, and it grated on him. He stepped forward, his voice louder. "This is all very sweet, but rules are rules. If everyone starts setting up tables on the sidewalk, we'll have a flea market." He turned to the crowd, seeking support. "Don't you want our neighborhood to stay orderly?" A few neighbors nodded, though hesitantly. Mr. Gonzalez, who'd been silent, added, "He's got a point. We pay taxes for order, not for kids cluttering the streets." Susie's head dropped. Her shoulders twitched, but she didn't cry. Shaq noticed and stood, his presence overshadowing everyone. He didn't raise his voice, but his words rang clear as a bell. "Order's great, but you know what's better? Community. This girl isn't just selling cookies. She's fighting for her family. And if your order means you can't support a kid trying to save her grandma, maybe it's not the kind of order worth keeping." His words hung in the air. The crowd fell silent. Even Roy couldn't find an immediate retort. Susie looked up at Shaq, her eyes a mix of gratitude and awe. She wasn't used to someone standing up for her, especially with such quiet confidence. Mrs. Crowley suddenly stepped off her porch. Her gray hair was pulled into a tight bun, and she held her purse. She walked to Susie's table and pulled out $5. "Give me 5 gingerbreads, honey," she said, her voice soft but firm. "And don't listen to Roy. He's always grumbling, but his heart's not as hard as he thinks." Roy snorted, but this time no one backed him. The crowd stirred. One by one, neighbors approached Susie's table. Mr. Gonzalez, still sour-faced, bought 2 cookies. The teens, now pulling out cash, joked among themselves. Within minutes, Susie's table was nearly empty, and her old tin can, where she kept the money, was stuffed with crumpled bills and coins. Susie couldn't believe her eyes. She looked at the can, then at Shaq, then at the neighbors. Her lips trembled, but she held back tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you all." Shaq patted her shoulder, his massive hand gentle, as if afraid to startle her. "You're doing great, Susie, but we're not done yet." He turned to the crowd. "Who's up for helping this girl raise even more? I'm thinking we throw a little event right here in the neighborhood. Gingerbread, music, maybe some basketball. What do you say?" The crowd roared in approval. The teens shouted, "Yeah, Shaq, let's do it." Mrs. Crowley raised her hand. "I can bring my old stereo, and maybe bake a lemon pie." Mr. Gonzalez, still looking grumpy, muttered, "I've got a grill. Can make some burgers." Even Roy, still standing apart, felt his anger soften. He wasn't a bad man, but years of loneliness since his wife's death had hardened him. Something about this scene, the little girl, the neighbor's support, Shaq's quiet strength, reminded him of the barbecues he used to host when his daughter was young. But Roy wasn't ready to give in completely. He cleared his throat and said, "If you want an event, you need approval from the association. And I'm not sure we'll sign off." The crowd groaned. Mrs. Crowley rolled her eyes. "Roy, for heaven's sake, give the kids a chance." Shaq raised a hand, calling for quiet. "Mr. Baker, I respect your rules. But here's the deal. Susie and I will come to the next association meeting and explain why this event matters. You give us a shot, and we'll make sure it's by the book. Deal?" Roy blinked. He hadn't expected this approach. Shaq wasn't yelling or threatening. He was offering a conversation. It made Roy feel not like an enemy, but part of the discussion. He nodded reluctantly. "Fine. But I'm not promising anything." Susie, listening to it all, felt her heart race. She didn't know what an association meeting was, but she knew one thing. Shaq believed in her, and the neighbors were starting to as well. She looked at her tin can, full of money, and thought of her grandma. Maybe this was just the beginning, but it was her beginning. That evening, when Susie got home, she told Marge everything. About Shaq, Roy, the neighbors buying her cookies. Marge, though frail, smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "My girl," she whispered, "you're stronger than you know." But Susie's story was far from over. Ahead was the association meeting, where Roy and his allies could put an end to her dream. And though Shaq promised to be there, Susie knew she'd have to find the words to convince them herself. She went to bed clutching her grandmother's old gingerbread recipe, thinking, "If I did it today, I can do it tomorrow." Meanwhile, Shaq sat in his car, scrolling through his phone. He'd already posted about Susie, her gingerbread, and the event idea. The post racked up thousands of likes in minutes. But Shaq knew the real work lay ahead. He saw in Susie not just a kid selling cookies, but a symbol of how small steps could unite people in a divided world. And he was ready to help her take those steps. The night over Orlando was quiet, but in the little neighborhood that smelled of cut grass and gingerbread, change was brewing. Would Susie and Shaq convince Roy? Would their event spark something bigger? That depended not just on them, but on every neighbor who stood on that street that day. End of Part 2. Part 3. 3 days had passed since Shaquille O'Neal appeared on Susie's street, turning her lonely gingerbread stand into the neighborhood's focal point. Orlando was abuzz. Shaq's social media post had gone viral, racking up tens of thousands of shares. Local news picked up the story, and reporters were calling Susie's house, begging for interviews. But for Susie, the noise felt distant. Her mind was fixed on one thing: tomorrow's homeowners association meeting, where the fate of her charity event would be decided. Susie and Marge's house sat on a quiet street, surrounded by old oaks humming with cicadas. The evening before the meeting, Susie sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by flour and mixing bowls. She was baking a fresh batch of gingerbread, not for sale, but for the association. Her grandma always said cookies could say more than words, and Susie believed her. The scent of cinnamon and honey filled the house, mingling with the aroma of Marge's old coffee, sipped from a chipped mug. "You ready, honey?" Marge asked, her voice weak but warm. She sat in a rocking chair, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm night. Susie nodded, but her fingers nervously twisted the edge of her apron. "What if they say no?" What if Roy convinces everyone I'm breaking the rules? Marge smiled, her wrinkles deepening. Then you try again, but I believe you'll surprise them. You've already surprised Shaq, me, the whole neighborhood. Don't stop now. Susie took a deep breath and returned to her cookies, piping little hearts in icing. She didn't know what she'd say tomorrow, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't give up. The next day, the association meeting took place in the community center, a squat brick building that smelled of bleach and old carpets. The room was packed. Dozens of neighbors, from young families to retirees, sat on plastic chairs, whispering and glancing at Susie, who stood near the entrance with a basket of gingerbread. Shaq was beside her, his massive frame drawing eyes, but he stayed in the background, giving Susie space. His t-shirt read Orlando Magic, and he smiled at anyone who caught his eye. Roy Baker sat at the head table, clutching a folder of documents. His gray hair was neatly combed, and his thin-rimmed glasses gave him the air of a judge. Beside him were two other association members, Mrs. Larson, an elderly widow with a sharp tongue, and Mr. Chun, a quiet man who rarely spoke but always voted for order. Roy tapped his pen on the table, calling for silence. "Let's begin," he said, his voice dry as summer pavement. "Today, we're reviewing a proposal for a so-called charity event on our street. Let me remind you that any community activity requires association approval, and we have strict rules about sidewalk and public space use." He glanced at Susie, a hint of displeasure in his eyes. Susie felt her heart tighten, but she remembered her grandma's words and lifted her chin. "Who wants to speak first?" Roy asked. Susie stepped forward, holding her basket. Her sneakers squeaked on the linoleum, and she felt every eye on her. She set the basket on the table in front of Roy and said, "Good afternoon. My name's Susie, and I want to explain why this event matters. But first, I brought you some gingerbread. Please, try it." Roy frowned, but Mrs. Larson, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the cookies, grabbed one. "Oh, how cute," she said, taking a bite. Tastes like my mom's baking." Mr. Chin took a cookie, sniffed it, and nibbled cautiously. Even Roy, after a moment's hesitation, picked one up, holding it like it was something suspicious. Susie took a deep breath and began, "I don't want to break any rules. I just want to help my grandma. She needs an operation, and I thought I could raise money selling gingerbread. But when Mr. O'Neill, suggested an event, I realized it could be more than just my cookies. It could be a day where we all come together, as neighbors, as friends." She paused, her voice trembling, but she pressed on. "I know you care about our neighborhood. So do I. If we do this event, we can raise money not just for my grandma, but for others who need help. And we can show that our neighborhood is a place where people look out for each other." The room murmured. Mrs. Crowley, sitting in the front row, called out, "She's right. We haven't done anything together in ages. Everyone just complains, but no one steps up." Roy coughed, his face impassive. "That's all very touching, but there are practical concerns. Noise, litter, parking. Who's responsible for that? And who ensures this doesn't turn into chaos?" Shaq raised his hand, and the room hushed. He stood, his voice calm but powerful. "I've got that covered, Mr. Baker. I've already spoken with the local police. They're ready to keep things orderly. We'll hire cleaners to make sure the place is spotless afterward. As for parking, there's an empty lot by the park, and I've cleared it with the owner. Everything will be by the book." Roy blinked, clearly unprepared for this level of planning. Mrs. Larson, finishing her second cookie, added, "Roy, you've said yourself our neighborhood's lost its sense of community. This is a chance to bring it back. And honestly, these gingerbreads are worth throwing a party for." The room laughed, and even Mr. Chin smiled. But Roy wasn't convinced. What if it fails? What if no one shows up? Or worse, too many people come, and we can't handle it? I don't want the association blamed for poor organization. Susie felt her cheeks flush. She knew this was her moment. She looked at Roy, her small frame dwarfed by his stern presence. But her eyes held a strength no one expected. "Mr. Baker," she said quietly but clearly, "I know you're worried about mistakes. I was too. I was scared when I set up my table, thinking no one would buy my cookies. But I tried, and people came, not because I'm perfect, but because they saw I was trying. If we don't try, we'll never know what could happen." The room erupted in applause. Mrs. Crowley jumped up, clapping so loudly her bracelets jangled. The teens in the back started whistling. Even Mr. Chun, usually silent, nodded and said, "I'm in." Roy sat, lips pressed tight. He felt his resistance crumbling. Something in Susie's words, her sincerity, her courage, reminded him why he'd once joined the association. Not to control, but to protect. He looked at the gingerbread in his hand, which he still hadn't tasted, and suddenly felt old and tired. "All right," he said finally, his voice low. "I'll give you a chance. But if anything goes wrong, it's on you, O'Neill." Shaq grinned and extended his hand. "Deal." Susie felt her heart leap. She looked at Shaq, the neighbors, the basket of cookies, now nearly empty. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, she felt her small step could spark something big. That evening, the neighborhood buzzed with preparations. Mrs. Crowley sent messages in the group chat, coordinating volunteers. The teens, once mocking Susie, now painted posters for the event. Mr. Gonzalez cleaned his grill, grumbling that this is all nonsense. But his wife noticed him smiling when no one was looking. Shaq sat in his car, talking on the phone with organizers. He'd already arranged for local musicians to perform for free and convinced a few old NBA buddies to show up. But his thoughts were with Susie. He saw in her not just a kid, but a leader who didn't yet know her strength. Susie, back home, hugged her grandma as tightly as she could. Marge stroked her hair and whispered, "You did it, my girl. And this is just the start." The night was quiet, but in Orlando's little neighborhood, something had shifted. The smell of gingerbread, Susie's voice, Shaq's quiet strength, it all wove into the fabric of a community beginning to remember what it meant to be together. Ahead was the event, which could be a triumph or a test. But Susie, falling asleep with the gingerbread recipe under her pillow, knew she was ready for either. End of Part 3. Part 4. Saturday morning in Orlando exploded with color and sound. The park at the edge of the neighborhood, usually quiet and empty, transformed into a bustling hive. The air was thick with the smell of sizzling meat from Mr. Gonzalez's grill, Mrs. Crowley's freshly baked lemon pie, and, of course, Susie's gingerbread. Kids darted between inflatable bounce houses, paid for by Shaquille O'Neal himself, while local musicians played jazzy tunes that hummed over the crowd like bees. Posters painted by the teens swayed in the breeze, proclaiming, "Susie's Gingerbread Festival, for a good cause." Susie stood behind her table, now reinforced and decorated with garlands. Her blonde hair was neatly braided, a gift from Mrs. Crowley, who insisted the hero of the day should look like a star. Susie was nervous, but her eyes shone. The tin can in front of her was already half full of money, and the day had just begun. Beside her sat Marge, brought in a wheelchair by Shaq. Her face, though pale, glowed with pride as she watched her granddaughter. Shaq moved through the crowd, his booming laugh echoing over the park. He took selfies with kids, signed autographs, and even started an impromptu basketball game with local teens on the asphalt court. But his gaze kept returning to Susie. He saw her greet every customer with a smile, thanking even the smallest donors. She was the heart of this day, and Shaq knew this wasn't just an event. It was a moment the neighborhood would remember for years. The crowd grew. Locals mingled with people from across Orlando, drawn by Shaq's viral social media post. Reporters from local stations buzzed around, their cameras capturing every moment. A few of Shaq's old NBA friends showed up, adding a touch of stardom. But for Susie, the neighbors mattered most, the same people who, just a week ago, had walked past her table without a glance. Mrs. Crowley, in a floral dress and straw hat, handed out lemonade, joking with everyone she met. Mr. Gonzalez, grumbling about the heat, proudly flipped burgers on his grill, while his wife passed out paper plates. The teens who'd once laughed at Susie now helped her pack gingerbread, giggling when she corrected their clumsy attempts to tie ribbons on the bags. Not everyone was thrilled. Roy Baker stood near the park entrance, clutching his folder of association rules. He watched closely, looking for any excuse to complain: too loud music, a misparked car, litter on the grass. But even he couldn't deny the event was flawless. Police patrolled the perimeter. Volunteers cleaned up trash faster than it appeared, and parking was as orderly as Shaq had promised. Susie noticed Roy and felt her stomach, not she knew he still wasn't on her side. But instead of looking away, she grabbed a plate of gingerbread and walked toward him. The crowd parted, and a few people whispered, sensing something big was about to happen. "Mr. Baker," Susie said, her voice soft but steady, "I made a special gingerbread for you, with extra cinnamon, like my grandma likes." Roy blinked, thrown off. He looked at the plate, where a heart-shaped cookie sat, swirled with icing. His fingers hesitated, but he took it. "I don't know what to say," he mumbled. "Just try it," Susie said, her eyes sparkling. "And maybe join us. We could use someone who knows how to keep things in order." The crowd chuckled, but there was no mockery in it, just warmth. Roy felt his cheeks flush. He took a bite of the gingerbread, and for a moment, his stern face softened. The taste was familiar, like the cookies his mother baked when he was a boy. He swallowed and said quietly, "Not bad, Susie. Not bad." He didn't join the crowd right away, but he stayed until the end, watching the neighborhood come alive. Something about the scene, the kids' laughter, the music, the smell of gingerbread, made him feel part of something bigger than his rules. As the sun began to set, Shaq stepped onto the makeshift stage, a few wooden pallets, decorated with garlands. He grabbed the microphone and called out, "Orlando, you're incredible!" The crowd roared. Susie, standing next to her grandma, felt her heart race. Shaq continued, "Today, we came together for one little girl who showed us what it means to keep going. Susie, get up here." Susie, shy at first, climbed onto the stage, holding Shaq's hand. The crowd cheered so loudly she felt the ground vibrate. She looked at her grandma, who nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. I don't know what to say," Susie began, her voice shaky. "I just wanted to help my grandma. But all of you did so much more. You showed me I'm not alone. Thank you." She paused, then added, "And I want us to do this again. Not just for my grandma, but for everyone who needs help. Because together we can do anything." The crowd erupted in applause. Marge wiped tears, and Mrs. Crowley hugged Mr. Gonzalez, who grumbled but didn't pull away. Shaq lifted Susie's tin can, now overflowing. "We raised over $10,000, he announced. "And that's not all. My NBA buddies are pitching in another $5,000. Susie pressed her hands to her mouth, unable to believe it. The money meant Marge's operation was covered, with enough left for medicine and care. But for Susie, something else mattered more. She saw neighbors who once ignored her now smiling at each other, sharing food, laughing. Even Roy, standing apart, gave her a slight nod when their eyes met. When the event ended, the park slowly emptied. Volunteers cleared trash, musicians packed up, and Susie and Shaq helped Marge into the car. The night air was cool, and stars twinkled over Orlando like tiny sparks of hope. Shaq crouched beside Susie, his voice low. "You changed this neighborhood, you know? And not just this one. You inspired me." Susie smiled, her freckles brighter in the streetlight. "And you inspired me, Mr. O'Neill. I thought I couldn't do it, but you showed me I could." They hugged, and Shaq felt his heart tighten. He knew this story wasn't over today. Susie was just the beginning. Weeks passed. Marge's operation was a success, and she was recovering, sitting on the porch and sharing stories about her gingerbread with neighbors. The neighborhood had changed. The homeowners association, under Roy's quiet influence, who had unexpectedly softened, approved an annual charity event called Gingerbread Day. Susie became its unofficial leader. With the teens, who once mocked her now her helpers, Roy started visiting Susie's house, bringing old photos of his daughter and sharing memories. He even tried baking gingerbread with Marge's recipe, though the result made Susie laugh. Mrs. Crowley started a neighbors club where people gathered to plan new initiatives, from fixing the playground to raising funds for the local hospital. Shaq returned to his life, but didn't forget Susie. He sent her postcards from every trip and promised to come back for the next Gingerbread Day. His post about Susie went viral, inspiring other cities to hold similar events. But for Shaq, the real impact was what he saw in Susie, a little girl who, with her heart and her gingerbread, reminded the world that change starts with one step. Susie, sitting on the porch with her grandma, held the old gingerbread recipe. She knew there was more work ahead, for the neighborhood, for others, for herself. But she also knew she wasn't alone. Her little tin can, once empty, was now a symbol that even the smallest act could change everything. The night over Orlando was quiet, but in the hearts of the neighbors, a spark burned, one that Susie had ignited. And that spark, like the smell of gingerbread, promised that tomorrow would be better.